We live in disruptive times, times of uncertainty, but there are many reasons to be optimistic, even excited about what the future holds. And one of those reasons is that the technology likely to have the greatest impact on the world for the next quarter century has arrived. And it's not the social web, cloud computing, big data, robotics. It's also not Pokemon Go. It's called the blockchain. And it's the technology behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. So just a show of hands here, who's heard of this word blockchain before? Raise your hand. Okay, about half of you. It's good to have a young audience. So this technology represents nothing short of the second generation of the internet. And as a result, it's going to have a very profound impact on business, on society, and on government. So 25 years ago, under the Bill Clinton administration, and with the stewardship of Al Gore, the US led in the development of the first generation of the internet. This internet of information brought about some very profound and unforeseen changes both to the economy and to society. Today we stand on the brink of a second generation of the internet, an internet of value. And this internet of value promises to have as great, if not a greater impact on the world as we know it. It's also a once-in-a-generation opportunity for whomever the next US president is to step up and lead in a positive way. And if we do this right, there is an opportunity to bring about some very positive changes. We can democratize the economy. We can bring about prosperity for the many and not just for the few. And we can solve some of the most vexing problems that face the US today. Everything from reinventing the energy grid to solving the crisis of legitimacy in our democratic institutions. Let me explain. So when you use the internet today to send or move or share information, you're not actually sending an original, you're sending a copy, and you're retaining an original. Now, generally speaking, that's a good thing. It means that we have a printing press for information. So if you send someone an email, it means you can send the same email to everyone else. If you host a website, everyone can access it. If you host a conference call on voice over IP, anybody can dial in. So we have this incredibly powerful tool for the democratization of information. Except the only problem is that when it comes to assets like money, stocks, bonds, intellectual property with specific licensing requirements, sending or sharing a copy is a really bad idea. If I give you $20 in payment for something, it's really important that you know that you have it and I don't. And that I can't send the same $20 to every single person in this row. Because if I can just duplicate that $20 through my own personal printing press, the $20 becomes worthless. So it turns out that this is a problem that's afflicted cryptographers and computer scientists for a generation. It's something that's called the double spend problem. How do you ensure when you move an asset digitally, peer-to-peer, that you don't retain a trail of breadcrumbs, basically, that renders that asset worthless? And it's something they've been unable to solve for a long time. So it turns out that we need help from middlemen, intermediaries. And these intermediaries, I'm sure, are familiar to many of you. You think of banks. You think of big technology companies like Apple or Uber. They're an intermediary. They sit in the middle. Even governments. And these intermediaries perform a variety of essential functions in commerce online. The first thing they do is they establish identity of the two or more parties in a transaction. Then they create trust, a trusting relationship. After that, they perform what's called the business logic, essentially the clearing and the settling of a transaction. And finally, they keep records of what has occurred, and that can be independently verified after the fact. And generally speaking, these intermediaries do a pretty good job, with some very specific limitations. For one, they're all centralized. And anything that's centralized is vulnerable to hacking or to attack or to failure. And this happens with regularity across a variety of industries. Twitter, LinkedIn, JP Morgan, the State Department, the Democratic National Committee are all centralized intermediaries that have been hacked at some point. They tax the system. In the case of sending money overseas, it can cost upwards of 10% just to move money across border, which doesn't really make sense when you think about it, no one ever says the words cross-border email, but they say cross-border payments. It's just information that's moving across borders, and yet it costs people 10% or more. They exclude billions of people from the economy. There are 2.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to basic financial services. And one of the reasons for that is that they don't have an identity. They don't have a way to prove who they are. No birth certificate, no driver's license, no passport, etc. They capture our data, which not only prevents us from using it to organize our own affairs, but could also potentially undermine our privacy, especially when that data gets hacked. So you could argue in sum that intermediaries capture an asymmetric amount of value from the first generation of the digital age, just as they did, and perhaps even more so than in the pre-digital era. Next slide. So what if there was a vast new global network that was open to anyone and ran on every computer in the world, where not just information like PDFs and emails and websites and voice over IP and other forms of information, but literally anything of value, money, stocks, bonds, titles, deeds, IP, identity, even votes in an election, could be moved and stored and managed securely and privately, and where trust was established, not by an intermediary, but through collaboration, cryptography, and clever code. Well, in 2008, the global financial system was on the brink of collapse, probably right around the same time that many of the people here were either going to university or directly entering into the workforce. And somewhat propitiously, an anonymous person or group of persons under the name Satoshi Nakamoto outlined a new protocol. It's called the Bitcoin protocol, as a way to move money peer-to-peer across the internet without the need for a bank or a credit card company. And he launched this thing in 2008, this anonymous person or group of persons. By 2010, it was a functioning payment network, and today it's worth over $10.5 billion. It also has set off a spark that's traveled like wildfire to virtually every single industry in the world, from the world of computing to financial services to media to the arts to government. And it has created a lot of excitement. So when people think about Bitcoin, they usually think of it as a speculative asset. It goes up, it goes down, you can buy it, you can sell it. And that's interesting if you're a speculator, if you're looking for an alternative store of value. More interestingly, though, it's a cryptocurrency, which is to say a currency not issued or controlled by a government or by an intergovernmental organization like the European Union. And that's very interesting if you're one of the millions of people who sends money home overseas in the form of remittances and gets charged 10%. Now you can do that at 1% or less. It's interesting if you're in a place like Venezuela, which is going through a slow motion, complete collapse of the government, where the local currency is all but worthless and strict capital controls prevent you from moving money in and out of the system. There's a really useful example of why you might want a cryptocurrency not controlled by a government. But most interestingly is it's underpinned by this technology called blockchain. So for the first time in human history, two or more parties need not know nor trust each other to transact or do business or build value or start a company online together. They don't need Visa, they don't need a bank, they don't need an intermediary, they don't necessarily even need something like AWS, Amazon Web Services, to host their servers in the cloud, because they can do it peer-to-peer in a distributed manner. What's different about this technology is that rather than an intermediary establishing trust, trust is native to this technology, which is why we call blockchain the trust protocol. Next slide. So it all starts, next, click. We're going to go through a few stages here. So it all starts with the distributed ledger, basically a record of what has occurred, transactions that have gone on the blockchain and are currently going on the blockchain. It runs on any computer who's willing to host it. Next one. Transactions are constantly happening on this network, and they're validated by a community of participants. In the case of the Bitcoin blockchain, they're called miners, like pickaxe miners, not like little miners, who commit large computing resources to achieving consensus on what is true, whether or not a transaction occurred, whether or not the $20 I just sent you actually went to the person who ought to have received it, whether or not the vote in the election that I just made was recorded for the party and now I can't vote again, or the transaction in a piece of property occurred and the title moved from party A to party B. Once those transactions are validated, they are captured into this thing called a block. Each block is connected to the previous block, which is connected to the previous block, to the previous block, all the way back to the beginning of the blockchain. And importantly, all of the information in one block must reference the information in the prior block, which must reference the information in the prior block. What that means, simply put, is that if you wanted to rewrite a transaction, if you wanted to hack this system by sending the same $20 twice, you wouldn't just have to go back and move a number in a spreadsheet. You would have to go back and rewrite the entire history of commerce on this blockchain. And you wouldn't just be hacking one computer system like the system of a bank or a credit card network. You'd have to hack millions of computers around the world. And you wouldn't have all day to do this. You'd have to complete this task in about 5 to 10 minutes. And it turns out there's a lot of computing power that would stop you from doing that. In fact, by some estimates, the Bitcoin blockchain is anywhere from 10 to 100 times larger than all of Google's server farms globally combined. So practically speaking, this makes this a far more secure, trustworthy system for the moving and storing of value, and it also enables people to connect peer-to-peer. This is a revolution in computer science that is only beginning to play out today. And then, of course, they're timestamped, so any attempt to alter when something has occurred will immediately be spotted and corrected. Next slide. So what does this mean for us today, standing here at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia? Well, next slide. It turns out that Hillary Clinton, the now official nominee of the Democratic Party, has actually been far-sighted and clear-thinking in understanding the importance of technology, not just as an engine for value creation to help the stock market go up, but as a way to create prosperity in society and in the economy, and as a way to improve the lives of everyday people. A few weeks ago, she put together this comprehensive report, the Initiative on Technology and Innovation, and in it she laid out 5 principles that her administration would try to achieve if elected around the area of technology and innovation. By the way, Donald Trump doesn't have this. His understanding of technology begins and ends at his Twitter account. So there are 5 key things here. The first one is making government work better, smarter, faster, more efficient. If that sounds familiar to some of the older people in the audience, it's because in 1992, a book came out called Reinventing Government by Osborne and Gabler. And in 93, the Gore Report on Reinventing Government during the Clinton administration basically argued for the same point. It doesn't mean it's any less valid now, but this is something we've been trying to achieve for a while. I think the second one is perhaps the most important, which is how do you make a tech economy that actually works for Main Street? How do you ensure that the benefits that are generated from technology are not captured asymmetrically by a few, but rather are shared more broadly amongst people within the economy and within society? Developing world-class infrastructure to support the mobile web and the Internet of Things. Creating innovation and supporting innovation while also protecting individual privacy. I think that's very important. And of course, advancing America's global leadership. Next slide. So Hillary Clinton made history in this report by saying, under the rubric of smarter and better government, that the US government should support the development of what's called public service blockchain applications. What does that mean exactly? Well, for one, blockchain, because it's a way to move and store and manage financial assets and sensitive information, could be used to make the delivery of essential government services like Social Security and healthcare easier, more efficient, and more secure. It could also help to support privacy by ensuring that people's individual data is protected, and also improve its liquidity by enabling them to move it from, say, one health system, one hospital system to another when they move privately and securely without the need for the files to actually physically move, which is what actually has to happen today. And I think the biggest opportunity is to use blockchain as a way to help to restore the legitimacy of democratic institutions, to make engagement with citizens the norm and not the exception. You know, we all get together here every 4 years for this big thing. We feel like we're doing democracy, but after someone gets elected, it's kind of like sit back and I'm going to govern you, and in 4 years we're going to do it all over again. How come there isn't a more dynamic and active form of civic engagement? And then the final thing is that maybe we could use it as a way to ensure that politicians are beholden to their constituents, to the citizenry, rather than to special interests, where you might not get paid unless you fulfill a bunch of pre-required agreements that you enter into, a social contract with the government. There's an interesting concept. And as far as Hillary Clinton's concerned, blockchain applications end there. Now, that doesn't mean that this isn't going to change. The person who helped to draft this is a guy named Alec Ross, who wrote a book called Industries of the Future. There are other people who are involved in this, including Brian Ford, who used to work in the Obama administration and is currently running the Digital Currency Blockchain Initiative at MIT. But at least for now, that was as far as they got with blockchain. But it turns out that blockchain technology is not only going to play an important role in all of the other four, it's actually potentially going to underpin it. And I think this one, making the tech economy work for Main Street, is actually what most people really care about. Where the number one socioeconomic policy issue in the world today, in the developed world today, is this question of income and wealth disparity and income and wealth inequality, where the economy is growing, but fewer and fewer people are benefiting. And I think it's the same thing that's underpinned a lot of populist revolts in the developed world. The Brexit case is one example. The rise of populists in the United States, again, another example of that. Now, as long as this has been an issue, and this is not a new and novel problem, there's always been wealth and income inequality, the solution has always been to redistribute wealth, to tax the wealthy, to give money to the poor. And to be clear, that's an important part of the social contract and the social fabric, and we might actually have to do more of that. But could we, in addition to just redistributing wealth, could we pre-distribute wealth? Could we democratize the conditions by which wealth is created in the first place to give everyone a more equal footing? I think so, and I think there's an important role for blockchain to play. Inclusion and economic rights are the foundation of prosperity and of economic mobility. In this report that Hillary Clinton put out, she pointed out this thing called the digital divide. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this concept, that there are digital haves and digital have-nots, where there are people who are connected and those who are not. She wants to make sure 100% of people are connected by 2020. A laudable and important goal, and it's one that I hope she is able to achieve if elected. But there's another interesting problem, which is that a huge component of the US population is unbanked. They have no access to financial services of any kind. You might want to know how many people that is. According to the OECD, it's 45 million American adults have no relationship to any kind of financial institution. So they get paid in cash, or they get a check, they go to a money mart where they deposit the check, they get scraped on a huge fee. A lot of these people are immigrants living in the United States who send money home to their families who are living in their ancestral lands. You know, in the Philippines, 13% of the GDP is remittances. In Haiti, it's 25%. It's money that's repatriated from places like the United States and Canada, where I'm from, UK and Europe, to places in the global south and in Asia. The average fees for remittances are 10%. So you're talking about the poorest people in the United States who have no access to a way to store money, really, other than in the mattress, no way to move money other than to use these services, which charge them exorbitant fees, and no way to invest because you need a portal, an access point to the financial services system to do that. Blockchain technology can solve this problem. Who's heard of a thing called M-Pesa? A couple of you here. So this is a situation that was in Kenya, and it's got some applications in places like the United States. In Kenya, they noticed that nobody had a bank account, but everyone had a mobile flip phone. So the local telecom provider said, why don't we offer banking through SMS messaging? We'll give people a way to make payments and to store money, and we'll see how it goes. Well, that system today now accounts for 43% of all the GDP of Kenya goes through Safaricom's system. It's a victim of its own success. You've heard the term too big to fail. 43% of the GDP of a country going through one company is too big to fail. So what if you could create a global M-Pesa that where anybody who had access to a cell phone, and most people in the United States have a cell phone, 75% of them have a smartphone, could use that as a way to access the basics of banking. Not necessarily a way to buy derivatives or to invest in the stock market, but as a way to move money cheaply and efficiently, a way to store money, and a way to get access to certain savings. There's an opportunity to do that with blockchain, and it's the foundation of economic mobility, is this financial inclusion. The second issue is entrepreneurship. A lot of our work on the corporation comes from the work of an economist named Ronald Coase. And Ronald Coase asked a deceptively simple question. He said, why do we have corporations? If the best way to allocate resources in an economy is in the open market, a la Adam Smith, how come people aren't all independent contractors bidding with each other? And he pointed to one thing. He said transaction costs. So long as it's cheaper to do something inside the boundaries of the firm than outside, firms will continue to grow. And they will also erect barriers that makes it harder for entrepreneurs to challenge them. Technology has been dragging the cost of doing transactions down, and blockchain promises to drop them precipitously, where the cost of contracting, the cost of search, the cost of communication, the cost of collaboration, and the cost of establishing trust can be done far more easily and far more cheaply. What that means in practice is that smaller firms can have all the same capabilities as big firms without the liabilities, deadening bureaucracy, culture, an installed base of technology. That should make it easier for anyone with an idea to start a business and to move up in the world. And the final thing on this point is the sharing economy. You know, companies like Airbnb and Uber are considered part of the so-called sharing economy, but they actually have nothing to do with sharing. Nothing. They're service aggregators. They're successful because they don't share. They aggregate excess capacity, hotel or rooms in people's homes, cars, handyman skills, etc., through a centralized platform and resell it to a willing marketplace. They capture 20% of the value, but they also capture all of the actual wealth that's created. In Uber's case, $65 billion of value. Could you use blockchain to create a distributed Uber or distributed Airbnb? In our book, Blockchain Revolution, we hypothesize what this might look like. And more recently, examples of this, one called Arcade City in Austin, Texas, and Airbnb themselves just bought a blockchain company, are exploring this. I won't get into the details, but there's an opportunity to distribute ownership, not within the confines of one firm, but across the entire network of drivers, say an Uber. Allow them to contract, make payments, and coordinate capability in a network rather than in a vertically integrated corporation. That would enable people who today are gigging with very little job security and with no typical rights and benefits that used to be ascribed to the middle class, like healthcare and insurance, defined benefit pension plans, to have more of a cut of the value. Next slide. Secretary Clinton said we should be investing in world-class infrastructure for the mobile web and the Internet of Things. So the Internet of Things is this idea that in a few years' time, hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions of connected devices will be doing everything in our lives, from monitoring our health to generating our electricity to driving us around. And it turns out that if Mrs. Clinton wants to invest in the Internet of Things, then she should be investing in blockchain. Because there's only one way that billions of connected devices can be communicating sensitive information and value to each other peer-to-peer, and it's called the blockchain. So consider the power grid, for example. Right now we get power from centralized utilities who broadcast it down at regulated rates, and consumers have no choice. It's actually environmentally inefficient, and it's costly. Right now we're seeing the rise of solar power in a lot of parts of the world, Germany, the American Southwest. But right now, the only thing you can do if you have solar panels on your roof is just sell it back into the grid at a wholesale rate. So that's not really that helpful. With blockchain, companies like LO3 in Brooklyn and actually NASDAQ in California are developing distributed energy grids where if you generate electricity in excess of what you need, you can sell it peer-to-peer to your neighbor at a market rate. It happens automatically without you knowing it. It's more energy efficient, it's more resilient to failure and attack, and it would actually help to make you money. This is a fascinating one, which is how do we promote innovation while also protecting privacy? And it points to the fact that in the first generation of the internet, what we've seen for the past 25 years, there's been this creation of a whole new asset class called data. And it's actually the most important asset class of this economy, in the same way that industrial plant was the most important asset class of the industrial age. The funny thing is, though, we all create it, but we don't own it. It's owned by Uber, it's owned by Facebook, it's owned by Google, it's owned by your bank, it's owned by your government. And it turns out there's a virtual you out there, but that virtual you knows you better than you know you. You don't know exactly what you bought, where you went, who you saw, what you paid for a year ago to this day, but the virtual you does. So now there are blockchain startups that are using this idea of encrypted distributed data to help you control your identity. Imagine a virtual you that you control. Me, the citizen, me, the employee, me, the user of social media, me, the customer of a bank. And you only divulge the data you want to divulge in any given situation, preventing all this data scraping from being used to undermine your privacy. If Mrs. Clinton cares about privacy, she should care about blockchain. And then the final one is advancing America's leadership in the world. And this is where we should make a comparison back to the first generation of the internet. So in 92, 93, it would have been very hard for people to have imagined how the internet would transform our lives in both positive and in negative ways. But the US government actually took an active and helpful role in the stewardship and the development of the internet. For one, they ensured by and large that it remained open. But they also ensured that people were protected online. There's an opportunity here for the next administration, whomever that might be, Hillary, that they could lead in a positive way through a whole bunch of different concrete ways. So, government grants for the development of blockchain infrastructure. Mrs. Clinton has already agreed to a $25 billion infrastructure bank, which she plans to use also for digital infrastructure. Part of that should be allocated towards blockchain. Developing regulations that ensure that consumers are protected without also stifling innovation. This is the delicate balance that needs to be struck. We're not just talking about information here, we're talking about value, money, savings, people's net worth. There needs to be an active role for government. The development of technical standards, of spreading knowledge, of educating and advocating. There's a helpful role for government. And the most important thing that they can do is engage with other stakeholders, engage with civil society, engage with the private sector, engage with the developer community, and engage with governments around the world. So we live in an interconnected world. Things don't happen inside the confines of one country. They happen on a global scale. Next slide. It appears the technology genie has been unleashed from the bottle once again. At our disposal to transform the economic power grid and the old order of human affairs for the better, if we will it. But technology is not a panacea. It is not a solution for the world's problems. Technology does not create prosperity. People create prosperity. And leadership is everyone's personal opportunity. There are people in this room I see who are young. And that's good news, because leaders of old paradigms are typically the last to embrace the new. They're typically the last to step up and disrupt from within. It's usually people on the outside, people who are young, who end up creating the most lasting change. So regardless of where you are, if you're a student, if you're an employer, if you're the CEO of a company, if you're in government, there's a leadership opportunity. But there's also a leadership opportunity for the next president. And who you elect matters. And this should be an election issue, because the next president will be defined, for better or worse, as the president who either helped lead the blockchain revolution in a positive way or helped squander that opportunity. And I leave that to you to make that decision. So thank you very much.